So thank you everybody for coming. More people are going to be coming on. My name is Jeremy Pook, and a member of GW2. This is the first practicum for USA 500 clubs. This idea came out of the town halls that we did throughout April, and credit Joe for recognizing that there was an ongoing need for education within the organization. So we put the challenge out, and as usual, members rose up to that challenge, and the challenge was present, please, some ideas for information about what our members and their clients need to know during the course of the coronavirus pandemic. So today we are very glad we're going to be featuring Dr. Trudy Good and attorney Megan Taylor. They're going to be presenting on the topic of returning to the office, what employers need to do and what employees want post-coronavirus. Just as short background, Megan, again, is an attorney, and she runs an outsourced HR department. So Megan's business focuses on HR. And since the coronavirus began, Megan is essentially focusing almost exclusively on COVID-19 issues relating to human resources. Trudy is a clinical psychologist, that's been offering mental health services for circa 30 years. And the last 10 of those years, Trudy has been focusing on the employment setting and focusing on employees struggling with trauma and difficult life situations, which of course, unfortunately, plenty of employees will be facing that as they head back into the workplace. We've set up the practicum to go for about 30 minutes. Megan is going to start first, followed by Trudy, and then Q&A. Most of us by now are very familiar with the Zoom platform. We encourage people to put their questions into the chat. We'll be following the chat. We'll be taking questions at the end. This is also a first of two. Trudy and Megan will be speaking to us again next Wednesday, also at 10 o'clock a.m. And also, as a final housekeeping matter, you'll notice we're recording this. This is being recorded for the benefit of Trudy and Megan. The practicum is really theirs and not USA 500 Clubs. USA 500 Clubs doesn't subscribe formally to their opinions, to their advice, to the materials that they'll be sharing. That's the materials and advice of Trudy and Megan. So with all that being said, last thing is I'll just recommend that people stay in the speaker view today versus gallery view. That will allow you to focus on the presenters. So I'll hand it over to Megan. Please, Megan, thank you.
Well, thank you. Thanks very much. Good morning, everyone. This is really a challenging time from an HR standpoint. And so this is a very high-level view of some of the considerations that employers and businesses should take into account as businesses reopen, hopefully, eventually. Moreover, these are topics and considerations that I think people should have in mind on an ongoing basis because, as we all suspect, there will be other issues down the road. So these are some good best practices really to start implementing now. I've put in the chat box some links to some, I think, very useful information. The first one is the EEOC FAQs. And these help, I think, tremendously with the navigation of ADA and other leave requirements. There's the White House 3-phase guidelines for opening America, Governor Baker's 4-phase guidelines, CDC guidance on cleanliness and sanitation in the workplace, and then OSHA guidance on preparing workplaces. So I'm going to share my screen, I hope. Can everyone see that? Yes? Are we good? Okay. So as I say, these are very high-level considerations and really should be topics for employers to review and put into place. So before employees even return to work, there are some things that you need to keep in mind. Did you furlough your employees or did you actually lay them off? And depending on that consideration, there are some different things you need to keep in mind. But first question that I'm getting a lot from clients is, how many of these people do I bring back? And largely that question in terms of PPP forgiveness really should be something you consult with your accountant on. But again, you want to bear in mind that does impact your forgiveness loan. So you want to make sure you're keeping track of headcount and salary requirements to keep that PPP loan forgiveness status. Once that's determined, once you figure out that number, who actually should be brought back? Some of that might be determined by salary considerations, but if you do have some number of employees that you do not have to bring back in order to get the loan forgiven, how are you going to make that determination? And you should be very mindful about considering who comes back or not. What is the basis for making that decision? Is it a potentially discriminatory basis? I hope not. Or did that person file some sort of complaint prior to these events? And now they're saying you're not rehiring me because it's retaliation. So there are many things that you need to weigh when you look at who you're going to bring back. There's the legal and HR compliance piece, but of course there's the business consideration about who are the right people for your new business. I have clients where sections of their business have just gone away. So the people that they may be bringing back may have different skills so they can focus on the surviving part of the business. So you want to do a skills analysis on who is coming back and what those roles are. I'm sure many organizations are going to be much smaller than they were before, at least initially. So you want to be mindful of who are you bringing back and what those roles are going to be. Now that you've figured out who and the number, what's the structure for bringing them back? Is it everybody coming back on a full-time basis? Are you bringing back some on a part-time basis? If you need people in the office and you're looking at these guidances on workplace hygiene and sanitation, are you going to have staggered work schedules? How many people are still going to be working remotely? So there are many considerations about those folks that you're bringing back, and now what is the structure for how you're going to return them? So now you've figured out, okay, these are the folks that I'm bringing back. How are you going to actually mechanically bring them back into the workplace? So if they're furloughed, it might be a simpler process, at least initially, to bring them back because they're still on your payroll. Of course, if you've been maintaining or not maintaining benefits during that furlough, you're going to have to go through the mechanics of re-enrolling or making sure they have their benefits back. In fact, if you have not required them to pay their employee portion of medical benefits, for example, while they're on furlough, are you going to ask them to contribute now that they're back to work? If they were actually laid off, then technically you're rehiring them, and hopefully you have a new hire checklist that you can go through with them and making sure you're rehiring them as if they were new employees. And that means things like updating your I-9 forms. You won't have to have them complete it, but there's a re-verification portion on page 2 that you as the employer need to complete. For some staff, maybe back in the olden days, you didn't have new hires sign restrictive covenants, non-disclosure, non-solicitation, and depending where you are and what state, non-competition. Maybe this is an opportunity to look now at that and say, hey, we never got those guys to sign that first time around for the right situation, the right people, not everybody. You may want to consider executing restrictive covenants. And then again, if they're new hires, you're going to re-enroll in benefits. You'll have to speak with your broker about if someone was out for more than 30 days and you have a 30-day eligibility waiting period, how that will work with your benefits plans. I'm sure lots of insurers are working with this, and so maybe those eligibility plan requirements are being waived, but you want to consider that as you're re-enrolling. Then you want to see what the structure is for your workplace. What are your workplace policies? If you, to the extent you may or may not have had them before, you want to update them. Certainly remote work, there are all kinds of considerations about staff who may now be working remotely part-time, security of data. I've had lots of questions from clients about reimbursements for home office expenses now, that if I've been working from home for the past 2 months, hey, why aren't you paying for my Comcast Wi-Fi? So there are lots of things about remote workers that you're going to want to document and have a framework around. You're going to want to absolutely update your leave policies to integrate FFCRA leave with existing policies. So you absolutely need to get your head around FFCRA and make sure you understand how those integrate with mass earned sick leave, short-term disability, ADA, your regular vacation policy. And guess what? The Massachusetts Paid Family Leave Act that's coming into effect in January of 2021, all of those things will need to be looked at. One of the other things you need to update is your WISP, assuming you have one, which is a written information security plan required by mass law. And it's also security policies are also required in other states. But you want to address that remote workforce systems data. Are they keeping their data secure? Is everybody on the same home computer? And your daughter's sketchy boyfriend can now get into some personally identifying information of your employees, for example. So when you think about these updated workplace policies, you definitely want to have a return to work policy. And these are the things you want to keep in mind. Flexible work schedule, staggering, compliance with the CDC and OSHA guidelines on making sure your workplace is safe, social distancing in the workplace. This is going to be a big issue, is work-related travel and off-site meetings. I have a number of clients who have employees that travel regularly, and we have to figure out how they can do that safely and also comply with customer requirements when they go on site. Also, there are lots of things around employee concerns. How are they going to get to work on public transportation? Are they going to be able to deal with chair issues? There are all kinds of issues. And by the way, I suddenly can't see a clock, so I have no idea where I am on time. But you do want to consider absolutely maintaining open communications about COVID-19 issues and having discussions with employees to make sure that everybody is on the same page about what their concerns are and also what your expectations as an employer are. So one last slide, you want to address your employee management issues, making sure you're able to manage employees remotely and in this new environment. Always having SMART goals is really important. And assessments now, I think this is really important, will assist in future employment decisions. So you bring all those people back because you have to under PPP, but 2 or 3 months from now, things go sideways again, and you're going to have to consider other employment decisions. So I think it's important to get set up now for now and also for the future. Jeremy, can you help me on
Megan,
time?
yeah, no, you did, Megan, you did great. I mean, it's from a sports analogy standpoint, that was like a 80-yard run into the end zone. You covered a lot of ground in a very short period of time. So thank you very much. And
okay, I'm going to stop my screen share now.
So thank you. So for people that may have questions about what Megan just presented, feel free to put them into the chat. And now, Trudy, please.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Megan, thanks so much for getting us started. Now we're going to go to a slightly different level. We're going to be talking about the psychological effects of the pandemic on employees and what is it that employers can do to further support their employees coming back to work, besides some of the stuff that Megan's already talked about. So I'm going to move to my screen share. So in case you didn't all know, we as a community, as a country, actually as a world, we've been experiencing the psychological trauma because of the pandemic. Psychological trauma is when there are overwhelming demands on us as humans and we feel a profound sense of loss of control, vulnerability, and immobilization. So I have a short list of some of the signs of trauma response: difficulty in concentration, memory problems, sleep disturbance, high levels of irritability, flying off the handle very quickly, easily getting overwhelmed. We're not very good problem solvers when we're highly stressed and we're going through traumatic response or having a trauma response. We often are less productive. We may feel stuck. We can sometimes have a negative outlook on things, feel helpless, feel hopeless, and then we'll see other behavioral changes in people when they're having a trauma response, becoming very obsessive, needing to make sure that everything's clean and orderly, needing to have control over what they're doing, what their peers are doing. Some people become more disorganized, you see lateness, that kind of thing. So if I ask you, all of you, you would probably, if I ask how many of you have had some experience of this, I'm guessing you would all raise your hands. And it is true that that's very typical to have some of this. What we're thinking about today are who are the employees who are having lots of these difficulties, having it in spades, high levels of a particular thing or lots of different issues. I wanted to show you this slide to help you understand what happens to us as humans after a post-traumatic event. The good news is the orange line, that the vast majority of us after a traumatic event, in this case the pandemic, our functioning goes down. We tend to have some of those symptoms I just described, but within a few weeks or months, we return to our baseline functioning. And you'll see 55 to 65% of people do return to baseline, and they maintain that baseline going forward. The second line I want you to look at, though, is the purple line. That's the group of people. It's 1 in 4 employees, 1 in 5 employees who initially have high level of symptoms, a lot of dysfunction, are really struggling, and it takes longer. It takes months, sometimes up to a year or more for them to return to their baseline functioning. So think about that. Your employees, 1 to 4, 1 in 5 of your employees may be really struggling as they come back to work. What are the factors that help us recover from a traumatic event? Social support is key, from your family, your friends, work colleagues, your religious communities. Also having validation of your experience. It's an overwhelming experience. Validating that, having people say, it makes sense that you're overwhelmed, that this feels beyond your capacity. If you've had previous success in recovering from a traumatic event, you do better at recovering from another event like this. So if you've been through a very difficult divorce, you've had traumatic death in your life, car accident, all of those things, and you've recovered from them fairly well, you're more likely to be able to recover successfully from the impact of the pandemic emotionally. It's important to have radical acceptance that things have changed. They will not go back to the way they were before. There may be some things that are the same, but our lives are actually going to look different because of the pandemic. And then it also helps people to have tasks that they can do, concrete things they can contribute to either their work team, their home life. That's where all of the mask making comes from. Making masks is this nice, concrete, clear thing that people can do to benefit others. And it helps people feel like they have some control and they're contributing. So let's go to how do supervisors help support their employees as they come back to the office. First and foremost, if you walk away with anything, recognize that even though we've all experienced the pandemic, it impacts each person differently. So some of your employees will have experienced death of a family member. Other people will be under huge financial strain because of the pandemic. Other people will have family members they're still concerned about because of the risk. The impact for each person is different. So supervisors have to listen carefully to what is it their employee is concerned about, which goes to developing a menu of options, being able to think about work schedules that may fit various different employees' needs. One size does not fit all. Laying out one uniform procedure or practice is not going to probably work for your employees. Promoting good communication between employees for peer support. In times like this where there's a lot of uncertainty, employers sometimes get concerned about negative communication between employees, and that can happen. But if you're promoting communication in open spaces, like in your team meeting, in your individual meetings with employees, that allows the concerns to surface and it's less likely to get pushed underground. Peer support between employees can be really helpful during a time like this. Being transparent and frequent in your communications. So if you've been doing weekly updates to your employees, you probably are going to continue that even as they are coming back to the office, because there'll be new procedures rolled out. They'll need to know what your plans are down the pike. One of the things that I've become really aware of is that when a team is some deployed at home and some deployed in the office, communication is different for those two groups. The people at home don't get the water cooler talk. They don't see who's coming and going. They don't see what clients are getting attention. So you often need to have more time talking to them, informing them. Maybe they need to talk to each other a little more. If you have all your team together on Zoom, you'll notice those people at home probably say less because they're more in the dark. Check in with your employees frequently and look for concrete actions they can take. So if you need a new procedure for sanitation in a particular office, and there's an employee who is good at that, being able to ask them to do that, develop that new procedure, that'll be a way they can contribute. Help employees learn to chunk their work, because their work may have changed since this, and they may need guidance and help on how they do their work in different pieces. Finally, when you do have an overwhelmed employee that is just not able to do their work, the stress, their outside stress or their inside work stress are too high, it may be helpful to offer individual support to them, trauma response support, or coping groups where people have a shared loss or shared common experience. Like if one of your team members died from COVID, it may be helpful to do a coping group couple of weeks after you're back at work to talk about the impact of that loss on that group. I'll stop there so that people can start asking questions, because I'm guessing there are a fair number of them.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much to Trudy and Megan. So, and we're trying to keep these to about half an hour. So people that may need to sign off, feel free, but we're also going to keep this going till probably around 10:45. We did receive some comments and questions, so feel free to put more in. One comment from Elisa Keston is the power of volunteerism. And Elisa writes that volunteerism is extremely helpful. For those logging in from New York, Elisa puts in a New York-based website to look for volunteering that can be virtual, safe, with safe distancing. A question that comes in from Alan Margulies, which is one that I think a lot of the members and their clients are thinking about, is, and Megan, if you could address this one. So for people that can look at it in the chat, and I'll read it, which is, should businesses hold back from rehiring staff if the possibility of needing to lay off again in order to avoid a huge increase in unemployment costs? So Megan, you may defer that to lawyers and other accountants, but if you could address it, that'd be great.
Well, I would defer to the accountants on whether or not the PPP loan forgiveness is really an overriding concern. If it's not, and that's not an issue for an employer, I do think that's something to think about, is what is the future revenue stream going to look like? What's my business projected to be? And you may want to hold back for some period of time until you are more certain that things are going to, be increasing, or you see that there's some light at the end of the tunnel. But that is a problem, that these unemployment costs are going up, and all kinds of costs are going up, obviously. So if you really need to balance what your revenue is versus your employer costs. And that's something to consider if PPP is not really the driver.
Great. And this one's from Matt Plosiak, which I think could really apply to both Megan and Trudy, which is, how do you handle if someone doesn't feel safe coming to the office once the company's back in the office? So Megan, that's a question for you. But before, just 1 second, I just want to raise to Trudy. Trudy, how do you handle when an employee is at the office and then either an employee doesn't feel comfortable, or I think we can all foresee the possibilities of employees, I don't want to say tattletaling, but coming to an HR supervisor and saying, okay, well, so-and-so next to me in the office is coughing, sneezing. I don't feel comfortable being within 20 feet or even 6 feet or whatnot of that person. And I feel really stressed out about that. So two parts to that question.
So let me first talk about return to work. There's a question that I often encourage employers to ask their employees in any situation with return to work, but this is particularly important. The question is, how will you know that you're ready to return to work? How will you know you feel comfortable? What are the signs? And this is where the employer has to really listen. It doesn't mean that the list that the employee gives you are what you're going to give them, but you have to be able to hear their concerns and then figure out how to address them. So being very clear of what that is so that it doesn't become a moving target for the employer, that the employee says, well, nobody, you know, I don't want to have to sit next to somebody that's closer than 6 feet, but then 2 weeks later it's, I don't want to come back if anybody has tested positive, and it's a moving target. So figuring that out. And then the difficulty of the employee who's concerned about other employees is being able to hear their complaint or their concern, see how your procedures address that or don't address it, and make changes if necessary. But you do have the CDC guidelines and the other guidelines, and that's your bedrock.
I agree.
The anxiety, but you can't always do exactly what the employee wants.
Right. I mean, I would agree with that, that it's important to have that structure in place so you can say, we're reopening on May, whatever. These are the processes and procedures that we have in place. And we believe, you know, we're following the CDC, we're following OSHA, if applicable, whatever. This is what we're doing to allay your concerns. But I also have clients who have said, okay, we're ready to go. And we're hearing back from people that they just, quote unquote, don't feel safe. So that begs the question, or that they have concerns about returning. If they have a legitimate FFCRA reason for not returning because they have to continue to care for a child or they're under self-quarantine, well, that's FFCRA. But if you are doing the right things from a process to make the workplace safe, and they're not falling under FFCRA, and they're saying solely, I don't feel comfortable coming back, they've been offered their job, they've been offered to be rehired, and if they decline that, that could very well be tantamount to a resignation. And there is some guidance in the PPP documentation that if you make a bona fide offer of reemployment for that person, they reject, then it's something that may jeopardize their eligibility for unemployment, because you are basically resigning. I don't know what the mechanics of that would be with the unemployment offices to say, hey, we offered a job to Megan, she declined it, so she's no, you know, we have documentation that we did that in writing. She said, you know, we told her this is tantamount to a resignation. She's not shown up on Monday. We're considering her having resigned. How do you communicate that to unemployment? I don't have an answer for that. But I think there are going to be many companies where they do make that that offer of reemployment, and people saying, well, I just don't feel safe. It's just not good enough yet for whatever reason. And it might be a problem because they may ultimately be resigning.
Well, thank you, Megan. Megan, you've mentioned an acronym a few times that I think we're all going to get really familiar with pretty soon. Is that FFCRA? Could you tell us a little bit about it? Because that's a new acronym, isn't it?
Right, it is. It's the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. And it basically provides for paid and extended medical and family leave for employers. And so there's a poster that everybody has to post. So that's on the Department of Labor website, I believe. I can find the link and put it in here, but everybody has to have the poster, and it talks about exactly what leave they may be entitled to from a paid standpoint. And also you should have in place a request form for leave. So if someone comes to you and says, you know, starting next week, I found out that my spouse is positive, I have to self-quarantine, there's the form that they have to fill out. They have to get medical documentation in order for them to be able to avail themselves of the leave. So I think it's really important that everybody gets their head around FFCRA leave.
Great, thank you. So we're going to take more questions and go beyond 10:30. One question that's coming in from Cindy. I'm sorry, Cindy, if I'm mispronouncing your last name, Haddad, about people that choose to come in and others that don't come in, and she's asking this question about, okay, what do we miss out on when we're not part of the water cooler type conversations? Trudy, can you speak to that a bit? I mean, in terms of some people that will be working from home, others that will be in the office. Can you address Cindy's question?
So there's probably not a perfect solution to it, but you certainly want to have group meetings where everybody's on the Zoom call as much as possible, so that you have the people from home participating as well as people in the office. But I would make sure you give plenty of time to the at-home people to be able to ask questions and draw them into the conversation so they're not feeling excluded. What you do to entice them to come into the office is a little less clear to me. It depends on sort of what's keeping the person at home. If there are legitimate reasons for the person staying at home, such as they're a vulnerable individual or they're having to do family care, you don't want to make their life too unpleasant from having to work at home. But if there's an employee that's anxious about coming into work, but concrete reasons for coming into work, then I would try and engage them in projects that you're asking them to be as much part of the group office as possible so that they are participating in a full way and engaging with their peers.
Great. And there's some more questions coming in from the chat, so please keep them coming. Megan, as part of the town hall series, it was interesting. We had a back-to-back, one day followed by another, with management side lawyers and then employee side lawyers. And we're seeing questions in the chat that's addressing this, which is, what if an employee is being asked to come back and the employee says, I don't feel safe until a vaccine even comes out? And the employee then says to the employer, heck, I've been working from home now for the last 8 weeks. Shouldn't you accommodate me? I've just proven that I can be very productive from working at home. Why are you telling me now that I'm tantamount to resigning if I don't come into a workplace that I don't feel safe, despite the fact that I have no underlying, health issue?
Well, and if there's no underlying health issue, I think employers, many of my clients have said in the past, there's no way I'm going to let my staff work from home. Everybody has to be in the office every day, 8 to 5. And I think employers do have to revisit that. It may be that I have been productive and effective, and maybe it's cheaper from an office space standpoint to have some of my employees working from home. But in the end, it's a business decision. If there's no valid reason why I can't come into the office because you're complying with the guidances and all of that, I think at some point it becomes an issue of whether or not you still want this job, because we do need people in the office X amount of time. Maybe I'm being flexible and I'm letting people work remotely before, and I never did. But as an employer, if you are going to require some on-site work, I think that's appropriate. It's going to be a struggle. I mean, there's no doubt about it, but I think people have to work through that and figure out what works best. And it might be initially, maybe I agree to let you work remotely for X% of the time for the next 2 months, but eventually you're going to have to come back into the office.
Can I just insert something here? If employers have been resistant to have people working at home or having what often is called distributed work teams, there's actually pre-pandemic a body of literature that looks at when does it work to have a distributed work team and when doesn't. And if an employer is going through that process, it might be worth looking, what are the kinds of work that distributed work teams can do better or as well, and what are the kinds of work that they can't do well. And so how do you reformulate so that you can draw off the strengths of a distributed work team?
Well, great. So Megan, Trudy, thank you both for all of your time. We're going to do this again next Wednesday, 10 o'clock a.m. People can get in touch with the both of you via your USA 500 profiles. If there's questions that you want Megan and Trudy to address. Joe, I know Joe's still on. Joe, you want to add anything before we close out?
No, I just want to say to Trudy, Megan, you guys were the first ones to try this, and greatly appreciated. And you did a fantastic job. So I encourage all of our members to reach out if they have any questions. Number two, the second part of this looks to, we will have more information. We'll hear what Governor Baker said, and we'll have, I'm sure a lot will change in a week, as we know it can now. And so with that, thank you for attending as well, everybody, and hope you guys can sign up for the other practicums.
Great. Trudy, Megan, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
All right. Take care, everyone.